Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for staying. I hope you enjoyed it. The film, it's the second time I've seen it, and really got a lot more from it the second time as well. So, great experience to be able to be here this afternoon and talk about it. We will have question time at the end of the panel. When it does come to question time, if you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone to reach you, because we are recording this today. I wanted to start today and take a little bit of time to specifically explore how Le Guin has influenced each of our panellists' work. So we're just going to take it a little bit slowly and dig into this before we get into a more general discussion. So I'd actually like to start with Emily. And I'm going to read this so I get it right, but you produced an artefact entitled Female Orgasm, a Codex of Sorts, after Ursula Le Guin. A typographic response to Le Guin's Kesh word, did we decide was barnhay?
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 It could be barn.
Meaning acceptance, inclusion, insight, understanding, female orgasm. So, what?
Yeah.
Let me hand that one over.
I think barnhay is both, well, it's the orgasm, but it's also to have the orgasm. So it's got that kind of verb quality, which is amazing. And I kind of came to her work thinking about a different way to look at sculpture. So like when I went to art school, it's like to make a sculpture, you kind of attacked a bit of wood and cut into it. And because of its shape, you would often make something phallic. And for me, it's like the way Ursula works, it's like Donna Haraway said, it's like casting a net over a space. So it's a completely different spatial model. And it's like the way she's drawing those maps, she's kind of creating like a garden. And so it gave me a way to think about installation differently. Like it's not so much like a subject-object, it's like you're in this garden of knowledge. And so this idea of barnhay is this kind of space of inclusion, a kind of opening, a feminine space, space of possibility, and then also this idea of a kind of motif, which I think forms in her work of a circle. So it's this idea that you move through that motif in different ways until it kind of becomes the story itself, I think is really interesting.
Was there one particular work that inspired these ideas? Was it The Dispossessed that?
I've gone, the works that I've looked at are Left Hand of Darkness, and the Kesh alphabet occurs in Always Coming Home. So, in that work, in that kind of anthropological lexicon. Yeah.
And can people find that?
Yeah, so we designed an open source font for Kesh, so you can download it now and type with it as a digital form. So you just by Googling, you can find that. Yeah.
It's actually really fascinating to lead into this because obviously as writers we have a different interaction with her work.
Yeah, you have to do something with the font.
Yes, we'll have to write a story with it. Gillian, as Rosie said, you were reviewed by Le Guin. That must have been rather terrifying, but also wonderful because she wrote a wonderful review. I read it. And I noticed that Tales of a Tory is often mentioned in the same breath as Earthsea, as a similar kind of reading experience. Have you noticed that?
Well, she was certainly a very strong influence on me, and my other contact with her is that I was once asked at a writers' festival, "Are you Ursula Le Guin?" And I had to very sadly say, "No, I'm not, I wish I were." And I was absurdly flattered by being mistaken for her. But I actually read her when she was first publishing, because I'm that old. There's only 12 years in between us. And in many ways, our lives have been a little bit parallel. And so I felt quite a strong affinity with her. She was also a linguist. She studied French, as I did. She had a long and stable marriage like me. She had 3 children. When she speaks of her literary influences, Victor Hugo, Tolstoy, Virginia Woolf. They're all my influences as well. But when I came to The Left Hand of Darkness, it just hit me like, I don't know, like I was exploded from inside. I'd never read a book like it. And almost like David Mitchell said in the movie about Earthsea, I think it was that book that made me want to become a writer. I had a fairly sort of dislocated childhood and teenage, and when I read Left Hand of Darkness, I'd never encountered anything that so encapsulated my own emotional landscape. And I think that anthropological approach is something like what it's like to live in a foster family, or what it's like to live in a different culture while you're still quite young, in that you're never quite sure of the rules. You're always trying to work out what's going on. You're trying to kind of put yourself in this society when you don't understand anything about it. And I felt that so much reading Left Hand of Darkness. So you feel I felt at home in her worlds, while constantly feeling like an alien, like Genli. And when Estraven says, "Why can I never set my heart on a possible thing?" That's how I feel in my life. I'm always trying to do something that's too hard for me, that's too difficult. And I think that was what I learned from The Left Hand of Darkness, reading it at that age.
That's really fascinating. And do you know how the review came about, that when your book was reviewed?
I have no idea. I think it was in the UK edition of The Guardian, am I right? And
yes. Yes.
somebody sent it to her and asked her if she would review it, and to my utter astonishment, she did. And
Did you correspond with her at all after that?
No, I didn't. It was For Heaven's Net is Wide, which is probably the most Taoist of my books, and I also felt that was a link between us, because it's a little bit like the title and the epigraph for the Lathe of Heaven, and it goes, "Heaven's net is wide, but its mesh is fine," which is the same meaning as God's mills grind slow, but they grind small. And it's one of those sayings that I've always liked very much. It means that there is justice in the universe. Even if you can't see it happening all at once, it will happen in the long run. And the other thing is, she also wrote a book called The Eye of the Heron, and I wrote a book called The Harsh Cry of the Heron. So we've got
There's some synchronicity happening
titles,
there.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I know with Isobelle that it's been the focus of your PhD. I imagine your love affair started with Le Guin a lot earlier than your PhD, but perhaps you could tell everybody a little bit about that focus and your visit to the University of Oregon to look at all her letters in the archives, which is fascinating.
I guess it's interesting listening to Gillian talk about the likeness, because I felt it too, but I felt it more, that sense of being an alien in the world. I felt that without having to go anywhere else or be an orphan. I just felt that in my own world, in my own family. I wished I had been adopted. So I felt that sense of dislocation, and I also recognised in reading Le Guin my emotional landscape, that sense of being a stranger in a strange land, that I think is the best place for a writer, in a way, that to always feel you're a stranger, so that you lack a skin and you observe more and you feel more. So I felt that way as a kid, and so reading it in Le Guin, I felt that very strongly. I didn't encounter her as a child. I encountered her in my late teens, and I read her from the first book. I felt that same sense of recognition of myself somewhere in there. So I read my way through everything she wrote, because I was trying to figure out how she did it. I was also a writer as a kid, like Le Guin, and I don't remember wanting to be a writer. I simply was one. So I recognised that. But what she was doing was so far beyond what I wanted to do, and yet somewhere in there, I was too. Something in there seemed to me to align with something I was trying to do. So I read her constantly as a young woman, trying to understand by reading her fiction what she was doing. And I did finally figure it out. I figured it out in somewhat the same way Le Guin did, by reading a different book that told me what I did. For her, it was a book she read when she was a child from her father's library. For me, it was also a book I read when I was a child. And in it, I recognised that what I was trying to do was that actually anthropological approach. I didn't know that then. I wouldn't have even known the word anthropology when I was growing up. But that's what I was trying to do. It was a way of making sense of the world. And that's what I was doing with my writing. And that's what I recognised, a superior level of that in her writing. So when I came to doing a PhD, I was looking to, I wanted to engage in, I wanted to look at my own way of writing, that anthropological approach, and I wanted to look very closely at my own work. So I also wanted to look at something else to compare myself with. And Le Guin was the obvious person because she was so formative for me. So by engaging her writing and looking at her writing, I could look at the parallels in our writing, the parallels in our lives, which I also saw, and also how if you begin writing as a child, which many, many writers do, of course, I think it's different than coming to it and starting to write as an adult. I think you learn it in a different way. You come to it and you learn your art through reading rather than by studying. You learn your art through reading fiction, I think, and being drawn towards the best you can find. So for me, my PhD looks at a particular technique we both use, which is a way of engaging real-world questions. In many ways, it's talking about what she was talking about in the film, which is that science fiction and fantasy, the fantastic, allows an engagement with real-world questions. And for a long time, in a historical sense, that wasn't seen as something that fantasy could do. But all of us do that, are striving to do that. Everything you write is an engagement with the real world. How could it be anything else? Even if it's commodified fantasy, it's still an engagement with real world questions, but it's like a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. It's faded and it's grainy. So my PhD study, it really is just looking at a particular technique we both use that engages the fantastic and realism as modes and produces a particular effect. And that's basically what I'm trying to do.
And I can see why the ethnographic approach is attracted for you, because it was similarly attractive for Le Guin. I did mention that Isobelle went to Oregon, but we'll talk about the letters in a little bit. We don't have to talk about that now. Fascinating glimpse into her personal life. I wanted to ask you a little bit. I mean, they talk about Le Guin as a creator of ambiguous utopias. When she received the National Book Foundation Award, which she made this wonderful speech, and if you haven't read it, listened to it, you really should go and find it. And I just want to draw a small quote from her speech to the National Book Foundation, and she said, "Hard times are coming when we will be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now and can see through our fear-stricken society and our technologies to other ways of being and even imagine some real grounds for hope." And she said, resistance and change often begins with art. And I guess my question to you, all of you, is do you feel a sense of responsibility to create hope in your work? And Emily, is that something you've thought about?
Yes, I think, well, it's a really important question. I think one question is, where do you locate the utopia? Because you could locate it in her life as well as the worlds that she creates, or her life is one of the worlds. And for me, a utopia is a kind of embedded, embodied living of a new world. So therein lies, it has this imperfection. It's not imagining and dreaming another world. It's actually leaping into it and trying to change it. And I think that feminism from the 70s, that kind of late flowering modernity, it actually has no choice. It kind of leaps into that utopia.
So you'd be talking about Joanna Russ and...
I'm talking about all of those ecologies.
Okay.
I mean, partly came to it from actually considering my mum's work as an activist, trying to kind of set up feminist cooperatives, looking at different models for childcare, kind of diagramming and mapping what that future might be like when women are not kind of stuck in the home, and trying to imagine alternatives to the nuclear family. And so, I think, if you have the utopia, if you have that story of another world, then you do have a roadmap, you have a way forward. So I think it's really important. In terms of the kind of flagship shows and exhibitions that artists are involved in, there is more of a desire for us to be creating alternatives and speaking about what is actually possible. And I think we're kind of living in this world, I mean, maybe a bit like this kind of unbreakable Soviet era where science fiction was so important in actually imagining a utopia. These utopias, science fiction, help us out of capitalism. And maybe the problem is we can't actually imagine an alternative to capitalism sometimes.
Because you had there was a very influential Russian science fiction novel in your background, isn't it?
I was looking actually at, partly also I came to looking at science fiction from being asked to design children's art projects. Okay. And I was thinking about the idea of the future in Soviet science fiction. And looking at the Strugatsky brothers. And I looked at one particular work called Far Rainbow, which is a kind of cosmic kindergarten where there's like Armageddon comes and the parents can't go on to the last starship. They have to stay behind. And so the kids go onto this ship and it launches into a new world. So it's this kind of intergalactic kindergarten. Okay. And I started thinking about these children's projects that happen in museums like GOMA, and can they be like these intergalactic kindergartens? And it's this sort of idea maybe of a kind of revolution of everyday life that might be embodied in this kind of community art form, which maybe like science fiction would be considered to be not really art, but actually is so interesting and full of possibilities. Yeah, full of possibilities, that is the thing, isn't it? Especially when you're talking about children. Yeah. Gillian, do you, as an author of for younger people as well, do you feel that sense of obligation, of hope?
Well, I was always accused when I was writing for young people of being far too depressing, so I don't know that I'm the right person to talk about utopias. The thing about utopias is I think they're really difficult to write. I think it's much easier to write a good old dystopia where everything's going to hell in a handcart. But I just had one or two thoughts on this. One was that I was also very influenced by Marge Piercy and Woman on the Edge of Time, and I think that she shared an awful lot of Ursula Le Guin's ambitions and themes, like the anarchism and so on. And then I started thinking about the ones who walk away from Omelas, which Neil Gaiman mentioned in the film, and we also saw that extremely interesting student talk about it. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And I've recently read Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James, and there's this one of his episodes in that takes place in a city which is extremely like Omelas, which is very beautiful and very easy to live in, but which is maintained by child slaves hidden away and suffering. And I recently went to my grandson's school, which is a Steiner school in Mullumbimby, and it's the most beautiful place. You just want to stay there and live there forever. And you wish that the whole world could be like that. Why can't the whole world be like that with, beautiful colours and little vegetable gardens and everything's beautifully designed? And yet we live in a utopia, really, but we are like the ones who walk away from Omelas because our utopia is based on suffering of people all over the world. And trying to resolve that, trying to come to terms with that, and to resolve that and find answers to that, well, I think that that's one of the questions that I got most strongly from Ursula's work. So I don't know what the answer to all of that is, except she just gives us so much to think about, so much to ponder on.
Do you think, before Isobelle goes on and answers, do you think the fact that she designed these ambiguous utopias is something that makes her unique in her fiction, as opposed to, you know, the attraction that particularly that we've had in the last, say, 10 years in fiction towards dystopias? Do you feel that is she unique in that sense?
Actually, I found her earlier works much more gripping, and I think that maybe we could talk about that later when we start talking about gender as well. Yeah, but it's certainly one of the things I think that made her such a spokesperson and such a beacon for people, was that she had so much hope in her writing, and offers you all of these ideas and all of these different ways of thinking, and was so you know, such a stalwart against the capitalist system, as we saw in the speech after the National Book Award, that this whole thing about books being turned into commodities and so on. And I found that speech very hopeful. I started to see things differently, and I keep saying to myself, so did the divine right of kings.
What a great line that was.
And that gives me great hope. You know, capitalism doesn't have to last forever.
Yeah. Thanks, Gillian. What do you think, Isobelle?
I was just thinking of an article I read in which an interviewer said to Ursula that someone had said about her writing that perhaps she wrote science fiction and set everything away from reality because so that she could be hopeful. And she said that the least hopeful work she wrote was the closest to home. So she said when she wrote her least hopeful pieces of writing, it was set in the Napa Valley. So it does it's an interesting thought that she might have set her work far away in a striving for hope. And that distancing technique that she was constantly striving for, right? She mentions it so many times in letters and in her pieces of writing and in interviews, searching for an estranging technique. And when her first piece of writing was submitted to a publisher, the publisher rejected it, saying, "This material seems remote." And she said, "Of course it's remote. I was looking for an estranging technique." And when I was working on my PhD, I was thinking about what that estranging technique means. And I think you can go back to the fact that I agree with Gillian that her most early work was very gripping to me. And she wrote The Word for World is Forest, which is a very angry book, which is her response to the war in Vietnam. And she saw that book as failing to some extent because it was very angry, and because it was embodying her political ideals. And she was an activist. She was a very strong activist. She did a lot. She wrote a lot. She got engaged a lot in activism. But her fiction is something else. And I think that's my answer to this question about utopias. I don't think it's my job as a writer to provide hope for the world. That would be a huge thing for anyone to be given. I'm not the minister for hope. And I don't think that's the job of a writer, is not to give hope. You know, that would be then some kind of emotional propaganda. I think the job of a writer is to strive for the truth, or their particular version of the truth, to some kind of truth, to something that's real at the heart of what they're writing. And I think it's our job to strive for it inwardly, not to go out and preach the truth of joy and hope and utopia to the world, but to struggle for whatever that is in ourselves. And I think the whole idea of utopia isn't a fixed thing that's settled, because it's sterile once it stops, even if it's utopia. I think it's a process, a utopia, and a process that changes as culture changes. And what Emily said is true, that it's something you take part in and that you strive towards. We are all striving, I think, probably towards some kind of notion of utopia. And I love Ursula's utopias in particular, and I think she is really unique in that she produces utopias that are not this kind of this pinnacle and this kind of structure of a pyramid where at the top is this thing. Because if you think about a pyramid, it's a kind of an end. I think it's a more open structure and a flatter structure she's coming up with, where you have something that's a process like a garden, which is growing and changing and being dealt with constantly. And it's interesting with Marge Piercy too. If you look at a book she wrote called A Body of Glass, she projects a utopia. Have you read that one? A utopia in that, and it's a beautiful utopia, and it's very similar to the utopia of The Dispossessed, which is people struggling on the land. It's very simple, very non-capitalistic, very communal in the way of producing things. It's not about making money, it's about using what you need and making things that last. And to me, that is the best kind of utopia. But it would, and it's presented in both those novels as a constant struggle against something else. And maybe that's a truth too, that a struggle against something or towards something or a process seems to me to be a refinement of the human spirit, which is what writers are dealing with a lot of the time.
I suppose it's not a discussion about Le Guin unless we talk about gender. And it was really interesting to see the film and her reaction to the criticisms that have been levelled at her about some of her fiction, particularly some of the earlier stuff. I think there's an expectation that speculative fiction writers and perhaps artists push the zeitgeist and should kind of have some definitive final word about a subject. And I felt that her defence of some of the criticisms about the gender bias in some of her work was great, in that she sort of said, well, you know, this isn't my final work. I'm evolving as I'm thinking, you know. So, and what as Gaiman said, what she might write now would on a subject will be different to what she wrote 20 years ago. How do you feel about the criticisms of gender bias levelled at her?
I feel like, she had an amazing capacity for autocritique, and I think that is truly inspiring. With Left Hand of Darkness, I can use my imagination. I feel pretty comfortable in its descriptions of gender fluidity. I feel like it is really amazing. I think Always Coming Home, I felt that it wasn't going to cut it with these kind of wonderful non-binary millennials. It's just too binary, male, female, and also really essentialist. So qualities of the natural, for example, are ascribed to the category of woman. So I've started to think, what if you took that Kesh language and updated it? Because I think that Ursula would have been doing that.
She would have been on board with that?
I think so, definitely. So if you take the word for, or the negative preposition is P, and then the word huge is to divide in two. And then if you added that to Barnhay, you'd have a non-binary female orgasm. So that, I think, is a space of inclusion that everyone can participate in. And I think that's, like working in a university with young people, that's where it's all going. And Ursula is a huge reference for young people still, and I think it is about updating it and working with it as a living language. I also think what I would have loved to see more in that film is her autocritique around decolonisation and the kind of violence of the anthropological program in modernism. I think she would have absolutely had a lot to say about that in this time.
Thanks, Emily. Gillian, did you have any thoughts on that? And do you feel that it was warranted that the criticism that it was gender blind, some of her work?
Well, I was reading it at the time that it was written, and of course, she and I grew up in a very similar world, which was very, very male-centered. It's honestly hard to remember what a huge shift there has been since those times. I felt that she was underselling herself when she said that she wrote as a woman pretending to be a man, because I think there's a lot more to it than that. I've written in the male and the female voice, but the male voice comes to me more naturally. I don't know why that is. It's just what is in my writing soul. And I think it's the animus, and we all have that in us. We all have male and female in us. We all identify with male and female characters when we read. Maybe it's easier for girls to identify with either sex as a hero when they're growing up. Certainly when I was growing up, the heroes of the stories that I read were almost exclusively male. I can't remember any girls' stories that had any stories written at that time for children that had girls in them as the main characters. There were lots of supergirls who were secondary characters that I found very interesting too. But the books that I enjoyed the most were the ones written about boys or in the boy's voice. And I have to say that I like Ursula's books in the boy's voice. They're the ones that seem to speak to me the most deeply, that I find the most gripping.
Tom Swift, did you hear the Tom Swift adventure stories? No? Okay, sorry.
When I reread Earthsea, which there was a Twitter book club reading it last year, which I was part of, which was really fascinating. I was not only surprised by the lack of women characters, but also by the scorn in which they're held, which was mentioned briefly in the film. And Genly's attitudes too towards Estraven are very unpleasant at times, very dismissive and misogynistic. It certainly didn't bother me at the time, but that was the way the world was when I was young. Men ran the world, women had no power. It's kind of interesting that that's the world that I chose to write of in Tales of the Otori, which is set in a world like medieval Japan, in which women often were not even given names in birth registers. They were simply put in as onna. So it was such a male-dominated world. And in some ways, I do try to subvert that by having women characters who have their own power. But I was very drawn to that world, as I think Ursula was in The Left Hand of Darkness. But she did say once, writers write about things they can't do, and they also write about places where they want to be rather than places where they are.
Interesting. Well, I thought it was interesting, her comment that Wizard of the Earthsea was a complete failure in terms of feminist stories. So she must have had some self-reflection.
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, that's admirable, I think, her self-reflection, yes. Really, really amazing, yeah.
I know Isobelle has slightly different ideas about this because we've talked about it already.
Yeah, I just feel like she wrote that Earthsea revision, that little pamphlet, where she really talks about revisioning it. And that's really interesting. I feel it would be the worst nightmare of a writer ever to have to go back and rewrite something you wrote before because somebody else wrote that. And I feel like, she was telling the truth of the time and as she understood it of the world. And in that situation, if she had then written a novel, I guess trying to push the idea that women should be in this position instead, is that the truth of the world that she knows? Is that the utopian possibility that she puts in there? I feel it's far more interesting that she writes the truth, which is vivid and compelling, and I found completely relatable to as a girl who lived in that world. And inside the character of Ged, I can exist inside that character. I can imagine myself because there's a truth, there's a vivid reality to that character that I can inhabit as a reader. But later on, she writes books like Te Hanu or The Other Wind, which they're exquisite books. And I feel at this age, she speaks to me very vividly. She's writing Te Hanu from the point of view of a woman, and The Other Wind is written substantially through the eyes of a woman, one of whom is an older woman dealing with Ged, who is who's a man who's lost his power and in many ways is inadequate in the house with her, and he doesn't do anything, and she thinks, what's, is it all you can be? Is your power the only thing that you are? Now that you've lost it, you're nothing. And he's angst-ridden and angry and grumpy, and it's just so real to me. Those characters seem perfectly real to me. And that's the evolution of Ursula telling the various truths in the process of her life, and an evolution towards a different world in which women have a different position now than they did then. And the idea of revisioning, I feel that in many ways it's a different kind of obedience to a way of thinking about things. She was moving through a moment when she was disconnected from it by being a mother of 3 children. She said it in the film, and feeling sort of resentful that she was put. And so in some way she aligned. And that little pamphlet, Earthsea Revisioned, is a realignment. But is it, it's just a way of thinking about the past as distant from her. It's not her writing. It's not her as a writer. And so I feel as a writer, I claim the right to write the truth that I will write. And what that truth is and what it says to the world, that's a different kind of engagement than me writing my fiction. So I sort of feel like I want to fiercely stand up for the right of a writer to write their own truth. Regardless of what the truth of the time is, then that will be decided. Maybe no one will read that book, and that's the problem that you have then with your life. But if that's the truth you would write, I think that's the truth you have to write.
Yeah, I suppose it's otherwise you're writing for an audience rather than writing your own truth.
Propaganda, even if it's good propaganda.
Yeah. But I suppose the criticism could be that her interrogation of ideas didn't go deeply enough. And perhaps she almost admitted that herself upon reflection. But is that fair?
You look at a book like The Left Hand of Darkness and say it didn't go deep enough. Show me a writer who did deeper
on gender, though.
In general,
yeah.
I mean on gender.
Yeah.
I think what she was doing was brilliant with that novel, but she can't be everything and a goddess as well.
Quotable quote, that one. I'd like to circle back to the National Book Foundation Awards speech because she described winning the award as a vindication of the rights of science fiction. And she took a very large stab at the commodification of art, particularly in front of the people that were controlling the book industry or are controlling the book industry. And what I'd like to ask you, do you have any ideas about how and this is, I guess, part of her legacy, that speech, her legacy from that speech is how do we reignite the importance of art and the value of artists in society today? That's a can of worms, I know. But anyone like to jump on that?
Well, I think she's right in the sense that the works of art themselves can't be separated from the forms of capitalism. So they are circulating in this world, and how they are embodied and exchanged and commodified needs to be questioned. The problem is, so say they want to be free, right? The things we make here want to be free. Then how does the artist live? So I think that is what is not yet answered. So it wants to move towards this collective ownership. And then the model, though, that Ursula grows up with is still there. It's disappearing, but she doesn't have to take responsibility for inventing a new economy around it. I think we have to take responsibility for that. It's a huge issue for artists. We are totally exploited by institutions. We are prey to providing free content all the time. We also are doing invisible labour all the time. And yeah, in Always Coming Home, there's this this whole technological system that is remaining, and people in the society take turns uploading their labour to keep it going. And that is the kind of admin. Everyone has to do this admin to keep this kind of creative economy going. And I like that everyone does some labour. There's no non-labouring class in that society. Yeah. So I think we have to accept that administrative component of these networks. But I'm still thinking about what the alternatives are. But yeah, I think it's a massive part of the artwork, how it is circulated.
Maybe that could be your next installation project.
Yeah, I have thought about it. Every time I have a kind of commercial show, I think about this very deeply, and how, the kind of objects that will tell you about the problems they have with capitalism and how they have to circulate throughout.
Can I just
markets.
say 2 words? Universal wage. That will make a
Definitely,
difference.
Yes.
Is that all you've got to say on the subject? Come on.
This is a question for the writers.
Yeah, well, I was just pondering that and thinking, well, how are writers going to live? But of course, universal wage is the answer. I think we have to look in different places for art. I think we've all got to straitjacket it into looking at art in very available forms, because it is so available at the moment. And, you know, we've been sort of strong-armed into believing that what is successful and what earns money is good. And yet there's so much art that's being made. You know, making art is a human endeavour, and it is going to go on. So we just have to keep our eyes open for where it's happening on the margins, get away from the mainstream, get away from HBO and Netflix and everything, and that lure of, you know, the great
Filthy
success
lucre
and all these things that are hung out to young artists. You know, if you can make it here, then you've made it. But that's not really true. You make it if you can make something truthful, as you said, Isobelle. But I don't really know what the future of art is. It's not very supported by our government. And I think people tend to think that it's not really important anymore. I'm sure if you had a poll of ordinary people, if they thought art was important to them, they would probably be hard-pressed to find something that they could call art that really mattered to them. And I find that very sad. One of the things that is happening a lot is there is a lot of music happening at a grassroots level, a lot of singing, a lot of choirs, and they have a fantastic effect on communities. So I just keep hoping that these things will still be there.
Thank you.
And I guess if you look at things like fan fiction and the internet, there's also kind of a movement of literature around and story in this way too. It's not all commodified. So there's those possibilities. But if you think about it, I mean, someone like Balzac could hardly make a living too, you know.
That's so true, yeah.
You know, but it's always been difficult to be an artist. It's always been moving between, you know, moving in your society, looking for some way. There's always been a few successful people who can live. And, you know, you look at Joyce, he spent his life borrowing money and his whole family living off everybody and anybody, going to restaurants on the largesse of friends while he wrote his novel because somebody believed in him. So maybe one of the ways you could look at is a smaller net of support. For instance, if you're going to be published by a big publisher, they have to make a lot of money to validate their publication of you, so they can have 7 million books, the same 10 books in every single airport, in every single place. So if you want to be one of those, they're going to have to produce a huge amount of money to get enough back. But if you see, I mean, there's a young brother and sister team who wrote the Zecora series, and they've produced them themselves, and they make, you know, when they were selling their own books, producing them as real books, taking them out and hand selling them themselves, they made a lot of money out of that because they could afford to sell to a much smaller number of people who are devoted to those pieces of writing. So maybe, as Gillian said, to not look on such a global scale, but to resist that global scale by looking for smaller nets of publication where you don't need to be known by millions of people. You don't need your face to be all over the place. If you have a smaller kind of network that you can work through, maybe that's a way forward.
An open discussion, and maybe someone might like to pick that up in question time, which we're heading for in a minute. But I have, and this is a question that came up for me out of after watching the film, and so I'm going to put it to the panel. Is she seemed to live a fairly regular and ordered life, and there's I read an interview with her that used a Gustave Flaubert quote that said, "Be regular and orderly in your life so that you may be violent and original in your work." How do you feel about that? Because I brought up 3 children too, and I actually felt that I could relate to the way she lived, how it was presented in the film. But what's been your experience?
It's a beautiful thought, isn't it? I think often we think the other way around, like that you have this chaos and from that comes order. So yeah, it's beautiful. Works of art exist. How are they possible? It's so many different ways. So yeah, I just find
so
that.
You don't need a routine and an order?
Oh, for myself, well, I'm pretty messy actually. What comes out of that film is how much support she has.
From her husband particularly?
Yeah, I have a really supportive family. My partner is really supportive. Like Ursula, I guess I insist on that space. I go into a space, I do my work, whether it's digital, virtual, or an actual studio. And that's I mean, I guess that, like, also teaching young people, you find that it's that confidence to let a work of art exist. They deserve to exist. And it's their difference from each other and the fact that they do exist that's really important. And I don't think it matters all the time if they're really amazing. It's about having that ability to critique and be in the world and, change works. I think that's what's really important. And that is what will bring more people into that creative space that who've been excluded.
Gillian, do you have any thoughts on practice, the practice of?
It's interesting that Haruki Murakami says the same thing as Gustave Flaubert, centuries apart, that because he has such a wild imagination, it's very important to lead a very orderly life and have a strict routine. I don't think it's possible to be a writer, I don't know about the other arts, without sacrificing something, because you can't do it all. And if you have children as well, then you have to give up something. So it's either alcohol or drugs or I don't know, but you have to pace your life so that you've got time and energy for all of the things that are demanding on you. And the work is obviously one of the most demanding, even more than children. So you have to sort of sort it out as to where you're going to put your time and your energy. And that means being fairly organised, at least it always did for me.
I'm just reading Murakami's book about running at the moment, and he says exactly that at the beginning, that he has to be organised, and he designs his running. It's frightening how organised he is. I'm not like that. For me, it's more of an obsession, and I think that's partly because of doing it when I was young. Everything else had to make space for it because it already existed before I became an adult. So it like water, it flowed in everywhere there was space and there was possibility. That's what existed. And for me, it's something that I have to do. I will try to do constantly. I'll find a way, no matter what it takes. And I think you have to be ruthless, and I think you have to neglect your children and ignore your partner. And I think you have to elbow out space and you have to fight for it. And I think it's, Rosie said before, it's like, she was talking about something else about taking the lid off something after you shook it and out comes this. That's what I think it's like if you allow it. If you allow it space, it will come out. And I think life's like that for all of us artists too. It comes out somewhere because it's necessary.
It reminds me of the discussion around Enid Blyton's children, who often talked about her neglecting them, and but also didn't Ursula's daughter say something like, when the door was shut, she knew not to disturb. So that's the supportive children. If only all the people in our lives were like that. I'd like to open the floor to questions, and if there is anyone that has anything particularly burning, if you'd like to raise your hand and just wait for a microphone to come to you. One thing that I will ask the panellists after they've answered these questions is what they feel Ursula's legacy has been to this world, but we'll get back to that in a minute.
It's just a comment on what you were last speaking about, that it made a big impression on me when Tilly Olsen wrote that she gave up ironing in order to write. I have been inspired by her.
You don't need ironed clothes. No.
Is there anyone else? Yes, at the back, in the middle.
Yeah, I was just thinking about sort of talking about the theme of people not valuing art and perhaps not seeing it as like attached to something with a monetary value. And I was reminded of the work of David Graeber, who's an anthropologist, who recently wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs, A Theory. And he was talking about how if people's professions involve some degree of caring, and I think art in a lot of ways is about caring and about sharing experiences, how that is devalued hugely in society, where the attitude is essentially, well, you're doing something where you get enjoyment and fulfillment out of it, so why should we care if you get paid or not? And that was just sort of a reflection I had, and and sort of coming to terms with art as a commodity. And I came to Ursula Le Guin because of her speech, particularly about capitalism and things like that. And it's not so much a question as more as a point of reflection. And do you feel that art and storytelling or whatever sort of form it takes, do you feel that is a form of caring?
Yeah, actually this whole idea around caring is really huge in the art world. It's kind of, if you think about ideas of self-sufficiency that you might find in those kind of 1970s utopias, it's kind of the opposite of that. What happens when we need to be cared for, or what happens when you need to care for an artwork? What happens when the kind of welfare system and the apparatus around being cared for falls apart? So I think that is actually an amazing area of inquiry. And I think I've read a pamphlet by that guy. It sort of came out of the Occupy movement. I found it at the Anarchist Book Fair. It was really awesome. I recommend that.
I think it's a very important thing to remember, and art should be nurturing in some way to everybody. That's where it sprung from, from communities doing things together that would feed their spirits in some way. And sometimes writers seem to be very isolated from that, but your books do go out there and they reach a community of readers, and those readers care for each other in an amazing way, and they also care for you, and they often write and tell you so, which is very, very enriching.
It's a little bit like Amanda Palmer, the way Amanda Palmer operates within the world. Yeah, yes. Vulnerability, exactly, yeah.
And maybe art has to be vulnerable. I mean, sometimes I think, I hate to admit it, but sometimes I think that vulnerability, that fragility of art production, that lack of valuing of it, that you're constantly resisting that, and maybe that's part of the act of making art. It sounds terribly punitive. I mean, what you said, if it's to do with caring or if you get pleasure out of it, you shouldn't be getting pleasure, so you're not getting paid for that. So, I mean, the idea that work can only be unpleasurable and then you're working properly if you hate it.
Yeah. Sorry, did you have your hand up there?
I just had a comment that I guess that argument, if you're talking about pleasure, how do you justify the huge salaries of, say, sports people that are doing something for fun, as opposed to artists. It just seems not right. And I think in Australia especially, we, sports is such a huge part of our lifestyle and society, and it seems that we get it a little bit wrong.
Yeah, it's certainly part of our cultural identity, and I guess how do you reprioritise those things? I don't know. When you find the answer, please let me know, because I'll be in line.
I think it's like salt in King Lear. I think that what we have to do is remove the art. Take away your music, take away your film, take away your stories, and see how dull life is without us.
Yes. We probably have time for one more question, if there's anyone. Yes?
So as in the movie, and we talked before, so we live surrounding with the patriarchy, and the most, in the novel, the main character would be the male. And even there are some superhero or female, the main thesis of that movie or the novel would be the love stories. So I want to know, as an artist or the writer, what would be the important things if you create a female character in a novel? Or should that just let her do the same thing as a male character, or it would be more other things important to make a real strong and powerful female character?
Isn't it interesting that we write male and female characters? It's what Gillian said about that animus, that it's in us to write both characters. And for me, I don't know how it is for you, but for me, a character comes as a female or male. And I just feel that's an organic process. And I remember an editor saying to me once, can you turn the character in this book into a woman, a girl? And I said, why? And she said, well, because you're one. And I just thought, so no matter what's happened in the novel, we just make him a her, and that's going to be okay then. It's a different dynamic, it's a different weight, it's a different balance. I don't think you can just correct the balance by turning male characters into have more female characters, and that would be enough. I think it's deeper than that, much deeper approach than that. Don't you?
No, that's just absolutely it, I think, yeah. Spot on.
I think Wolfie had his hand up, and he would have to be our last question.
So I guess I want to ask you about, the current power of independent publishing and how that has evolved in the last 40 years with, independent comic artists and zine producers, and now indie publishing being quite a profitable game. I was wondering if you had any real mix in that kind of field, and if you think it's something that's worthwhile to talk about.
Have you had any experience in that? I should answer that. Well, I think I've probably had this discussion with Wolfie before. I'm sure he'd like to hear from you. But have you had any experience with... Well, you've had... Your graphic novel was an experience with indie publishing.
With indie publishing.
Yeah.
Well, I mean... the beautiful, strange thing about this increasing capitalisation and this increasing, this lessening in number of things being published, this huge amount of money being pumped to a few big name authors, and then the odd emergent writer gets funded hugely as well, and it's less and less people being published, and I've completely lost track of what I was saying.
I don't know, but I was just thinking, as you were speaking, I was thinking about something else. So there you go, we must be at the end of the panel. But I was thinking about the idea of, which Emily was talking about the more collaborative thing, where and what you said about not having to have your face a million places. Perhaps as writers, we need to stop buying into, being rich and famous in the sense of, selling the numbers that a book like Twilight has, and look at our art and how best we can engage with our art in our community in terms of indie publishing and zines and comic and I mean that's a space that you're working in. So maybe we need to change the way we think about it
And
as
we
well.
should have a degree in cosplay. We were discussing.
Exactly, we talked about that
People
before.
want to do that degree.
Exactly, and it's
It
an
would
art
be
form.
amazing.
It is an art form. I think.
Can I just finish
Yes.
that? It was what
You
you
do
were
remember-
saying.
oh, okay.
I do. It was to say that I think there's a real rise in indie publication again, and the strange thing is by the monopolising, which has killed off some of the medium range publishers. So Penguin gets swallowed by Random and various of these big ones swallowing one another. And a lot of writers are taking their work, like for instance me, we're taking our work to independent publishers because it both supports them and it's another way of, as you say, it's exactly that engagement in a different way. So we do have that power, don't we, to engage differently.
Absolutely. I would like to finish off today circling right back to Ursula, because she's the reason we're all here. And perhaps you could tell me what you feel her enduring legacy is to this world, because we're a much poorer place without her.
Yeah, so much, but yeah, for me it's that non-hierarchical, flattened space of possibility that she creates. And I guess going into the future, it wouldn't be the only map that you take, but it would certainly be there. Yeah, it'd be one of the different models that we can use to create a different society.
I was so struck by the writers commenting in the film. I mean, without Ursula, we would have no David Mitchell, we would have no Neil Gaiman, and so on. Maybe even no Margaret Atwood. So yes. that was very, very telling. I thought that they would come and give their time to pay homage to an author who had meant so much to them. And then they will have their legacy as well. And there'll be, writers now who are struggling away, inspired by David Mitchell or by Neil Gaiman. And
we would have no
through
Leanne Hearn.
them, by Ursula.
We would have no Gillian Rubinstein.
No, probably not.
Yeah, and she's rich. She's such a rich flavour that I think she's not here anymore. And I remember the day, it was so sad that she died. But of course, she was elderly, and she, in exchanges of letters, she kept saying it too, which always alarmed me. She would talk about her husband's fragility, her fragility, and but that fragility is only physical, and she does have that legacy of literature, and that's the beauty of literature. If you love it, you pass it on to someone, and so it moves forward.
And art as well. And on that note, thank you so much for being a great audience, and please put your hands together for these wonderful panellists.